glad we're able to be together here on this final day of the week. And we have been rejoicing this week at God's goodness as we've been looking at different anniversaries of the different mandates that came down for us here in Wisconsin this week, and all that we had to be going through as far as decision making and provisions to keep the ministry going. And I'm so thankful as I look back for God's goodness. But we need to look ahead. God has given us this opportunity for the advancement of His work. And I think of the testimony we're all familiar with from 2 Corinthians chapter 12 of the Apostle Paul, who talks about the thorn in the flesh that he had in his life. We don't know exactly what that was, but it was something that was very troubling to him. And he knew that God had given it to him because of the great blessing that he had received in the past, especially at being a writer of Scripture and the revelations that God had given to him. It's stated very specifically here that he knew that Satan had been allowed to attack him so that he could stay in a humble, dependent position. And God chose not to take away this trial so that the apostle could continue to grow and be all that he should be. And verse 9 in response to this says, "And he said unto me," that's God saying to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." I think one of the problems that we've all faced individually and as churches over the last few years is to think we are increased with goods and not in need of anything, like the Laodicean church. Now, we all know that that's not right, but we have found ourselves over and over to be overly contented with our position and really not willing to take the radical steps to be New Testament, to further the cause of Christ. And we've had a tendency just to depend upon ourselves. Well, here the apostle says that God told him, "Now, I'm going to allow you to go through this trial more because my grace, my intervention in your life, that is because of what I did for you on the cross, is sufficient. And the thing that is important is that my strength will be made perfect in your weakness." And Paul responds, says, "I'll glory in my infirmities then, because I want the power of Christ to rest upon me." And then he goes on to he says, "I take pleasure in these infirmities and reproaches, necessities, persecutions." Why? "When I'm weak, then am I strong." And frankly, I think we all have to admit the American church has needed to become weak, has needed to realize we can't do it. With our money, with our resources, with our freedom, we've depended on ourselves. And it's been pathetic. We've gone backwards. We have not affected the country. The moral revolution has taken place right in front of us and around us and even in some of us. We have seen compromise like we wouldn't have thought within our movement. All of these things have occurred with all of the blessings that we've had. And that's just the tendency. The Lord told the nation of Israel, when you get into the land, don't forget that those villages I gave you, those cities I gave you, those houses I gave you, you didn't do it with your strength, you did it with my miraculous power. And we need to remember that everything we are and everything we have is because of the mighty power and grace of God. So there are times that God has to allow us to be weak. And as we go through trials and as we get frustrated, I am sure there are going to be waves of things coming up. We need to stop and say, I want to be like the Apostle Paul. I'm going to glory in my infirmities because I want the power of Christ to rest upon me. For when I'm weak, that's when I'll be strong. When I need God is when I'll begin to see God. And so I trust that we will not fear what comes up, that this is going to be a good year because God's here and God's working and God's stirring up believers. And so let's don't look for circumstances to be right. Let's look for our hearts to be right. And let's glory in whatever God does allow so that He can be seen as strong.